Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ask a PST Professional Scrum Trainer. My name is Patricia Kong. Today I have with me Simon Flossmann and David Spinks. Hello.
Hi, Patricia.
Hey. So today we're going to talk about the power of facilitation and how we can use that to improve the Scrum events and other interactions that you might be facing in Scrum and Agile environments. And before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping rules, quick guidelines. As usual, your microphones will be muted throughout. This session is recorded, and the recording and slides will be available for everyone after the webinar within 24 hours. This is Ask a PST, so make sure you're submitting your questions through the Q&A. That's how we'll be seeing them. I'll be moderating today for you. So just a quick reminder on who is Scrum.org. Scrum.org is us. We're a global community thinking about training, education in the Scrum and Agile space. So that handsome gentleman in the left, that's Ken Schwaber. He is the co-creator of Scrum and the president of our company and an inspiration to me every day. So David, why don't we go to you with a quick introduction of yourself?
Sure. So my name is David Spinks. I'm based in the UK. My background is in software development. I did that for about 10 years before I discovered Scrum and the Agile space. So I've worked over the last 12 years or so as a Scrum Master, Product Owner, Agile Coach. I've been a Scrum.org Professional Scrum Trainer since 2019. I'm also an accredited trainer with Kanban University, so I train the Kanban method. And I offer my services through my company, Red Tangerine, which I co-founded a few years ago. I'm also an author of the books Adopting Agile Across Borders, which is all about use of Agile in different parts of the world, in different cultures, and upcoming book, which is due out any day now in different parts of the world, Mastering Collaboration in a Product Team, which is all about different collaboration techniques to build great products. So that's me.
Congratulations. I'll expect a signed copy.
Of course, Patricia, of course.
All right, Simon.
Me too, please. Yeah, my name is Simon. When I started working, basically, I started as a product owner. I always was looking for ways on how to collaborate with stakeholders and basically let them do the work. That's the way I discovered facilitation. I started to collecting all the tools and techniques which are helpful to let other people do the work and just try to help them to common outcome. And one day I was running in Retrospective. I think it was pretty good. We used, I don't know, like 10, 15 techniques whatsoever. And after that, my mentor at that time asked me, oh, if you run so great Retrospective, how is your team doing? Are you delivering a lot of value to your customers and users? And I said, hold on a minute. What you're talking about, users, customers, value, we don't deliver at all. And that made me realize at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what techniques you use, what tools you have and how many. It's about the outcome, what you achieve with those tools. And from that day on, I'm looking for the simplest version to get to an outcome. And hopefully I can share a couple of lessons and examples throughout the day. That's me.
All right, excellent. Thank you. So David and Simon and I have collaborated together on a new course that Scrum.org just launched, and that class was the course is around facilitation skills, and we thought about it specifically in the realm of a Scrum setting. So in that course, in that class, you'll find a lot of different scenarios that we've experienced coaching, training, consulting, being in Scrum teams or in an organization. So we're happy to take some of those questions that you have in terms of some of the typical things that you're facing that you want some advice from us. One of the things that David Spinks and I just did recently was a webinar on the notion of alignment and facilitating conversations around alignment that we think there's alignment, but you know, at the end of the day, everybody kind of retracts and we don't agree. And we talked through why is that. And so we had a lot of questions. And one of them I'd like to carry forward was really around this notion of a goal. So for instance, when you're in sprint planning and instead of asking David, I'm going to ask Simon because he likes hard questions. How do you think about facilitation and the team, and what could be improved when you get into the situation where you're in sprint planning and the team gets to the end and they talk about all these things and they just can't agree on a sprint goal? And the dynamics that you have in there obviously are the different accountabilities, right? And the different values. So you think about commitment. People can't agree to a goal. What does that mean? You think about the product owner. Should the product owner just say, hey, this is the goal, we're moving forward? I've certainly done that. So what is your suggestion, and how do you think about that in terms of facilitation?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I had this a couple of times. So it was it's how it's written in the Scrum guide, that the product owner proposes a sprint goal and more or less the developer commit to it, which is not true. So the Scrum guide more mentions that the whole team commits to the goal. And at that team, it was like that. Product owner proposes a goal, and the team or the rest of the team has to commit to it. And it never lasted long. Most of the time, the sprint planning took ages, and none of them really committed to the goal because everybody thought, okay, that's not feasible, that's not doable. And one way I changed this was, it was a tough idea. I asked everybody at the beginning of the planning to come up with a sprint goal, not just the product owner. So we had 10 people in the team, then we had 10 different goals. And now we looked at, so how can we converge those different goals? So where are the similarities? Where are the differences, and why? So we spent a lot of time thinking about the goal, but on the long run, this helped the team actually to own the decision, which resulted more in a commitment towards it. One structure you can use here, for instance, I guess everybody knows this one, is this 1, 2 for all, where you give everybody a minute in silence to think about a goal, then pair up with other person, try to combine those goals or refine it even more, and then enforce some. So you can really quickly generate 2 to 3 goals. And that's something you can start with.
So starting with that, so you talked about liberating structure 1, 2 for all, and that's a great way. They come in and, you know, let's assume there's a safe environment. It's not about, oh, we're coming up with this goal, nobody really cares what I say anyways. Let's remove some of that. That environment needs to exist. That's a different conversation maybe, and if there's more questions about it, we can answer that. What happens when you end up with those 2, 3, 4, 5 goals, or 3 goals? Because we talked about the converging, how would you decide which one then is the sprint goal? Because the other thing that you can end up, that we're familiar with, is a list of sprint goals.
Yes.
David, do you want to take that, or Simon?
Yeah, that's certainly something I see a lot, and even going so far where some Scrum teams might bring in 7 product backlog items into a sprint, and then they're making each one of those a sprint goal as well. That's something that I've seen a lot. Just a very simple question I would ask that group is, what's the most important? What's the most valuable one out of those goals? Because in Scrum, there's nothing that says we can't work on other things. We just need to create that focus around that one thing. So that'd be my question. Out of these goals that we've identified, as a group with the product owner collaboratively, can we decide what is the most important, what's the most valuable? That's our sprint goal. Everything else is a bonus. So we can still bring that into the sprint planning, but we want to create that focus on that one thing. What I wouldn't want to see is this just mash up, try and then combine this big long goal, and we're having to write a paragraph to describe it, because again, we're losing that focus.
Oh, well, David, that's nice that you mentioned that, because one of the follow-up questions that we're getting, and we're asking a PST, is how do you form a sprint goal And what is the difference? I'm going to just change this a little bit from the guest question. What's the difference between an okay sprint goal and a great sprint goal, or a bad sprint goal and a great sprint? So you just talked about a paragraph, not a great sprint goal.
Yeah.
Because a lot of that and how we plan and how we work towards things, that's going to dictate the daily scrums. That's going to dictate all these other things that we have to facilitate. So David first, maybe, and then Simon, you can give an example also.
I think one of the important things, probably the big important thing, but one of the big important things that came out of the latest version of the Scrum Guide was the product goal. So having that clear vision from the product owner, this is what we're working towards. This is the vision for the product. So I think asking that question, how does the sprint goal that we're crafting during sprint planning, how does that take us on a step towards that product goal? So keeping that product goal in mind, I think, is important. And again, I think it's, again, having transparency of where we are, what's the current state of the increments, what's the next step. And again, I think being close to not just thinking about what's on our product backlog, but what do our users experience? So again, it's not just what's happening in sprint planning, it's what the feedback we're getting from the sprint reviews as well. So I think all of these things fit together. So I think, again, bringing it back to stakeholder feedback and what customers are actually saying is should be helping to feed into those decisions.
Mm-hmm. Simon, do you have examples maybe of just a sprint goal?
Yeah, so from a general perspective, I think Scrum is not about work, it's more about value. And this should also guide you in this for sprint goal creation and every other goal. And what does value mean? It's the easiest way to start that you solve something, a problem for a user or a customer. So start with that in mind. It's a good indication for value. And I had a team where we had a lot of activity-based goals. So what are we doing? Provide some features, some test environment. And one thing what we did in order to get the value perspective a little bit more is, instead of providing the user a logging functionality to our platform, the goal was, I don't know, 10 users are logged in successfully on the platform. It looks like a small change, but it's a whole nother ball game now, because you need to find users who are actually logging into the platform. And this is more value or outcome focused. And I think the hint or the insight I would give, make it tangible from a user perspective. What is different for a user after the sprint? What can he or she do now? That would be a tip.
Thank you, both of you. I got a hint from an attendee, Steve Traps, who's a PST. So I put a blog post that is in the chat for everyone to read. And for me, as the person who breathes evidence-based management, I echo what you're talking about in terms of outcomes, thinking about that, and why are we doing something. I even like to state my PBIs that way, but there's a lot on Scrum.org, and goal creating is hard. So that's something that's definitely important to have facilitated conversations about. So moving on a little bit, something a little bit similar, and we can get back to sprint planning. I want to take a look at some of these other questions. Is Simon, you and I talked about the process of sprint planning and the sprint retrospective being kind of similar. So one of the questions that we have here is, what do you do when no one is participating or sharing their opinion in the sprint retrospective? What facilitation techniques might you use? And I'll take it further and say, what if that means that during the sprint, you're actually not trying to improve anything?
Okay, this one is a difficult one without any context. So there could be a million reasons why that's the case. So the first one is, maybe people are quiet. Maybe the people itself are a little bit more quiet. Maybe they need a little bit more time to think, and so you rush them. And not everybody likes to create sticky notes or something like that. Sometimes it's really about the conversation. You need to find the right style for the right people. This is hard. that could be one issue. And other thing what you could try, I think, is if people are having a hard time to speaking up, maybe you miss a little bit of psychological safety in that direction. Maybe you tried with something very different. There's the idea of a TRIS, or which we call create a disaster, where you start with a what could we do in order to make everything even more worse. That's something you could try to lose up people a little bit, because everybody knows, okay, this will not happen, so I can make something up which opens up the people. So that could be the immediately step what you can do. But also you should look at the surroundings. So what happens outside of the team, which creates conditions like that in your sprint retrospective. That's also something we could investigate a little bit more.
David, do you have some different techniques too that you like to use, just and maybe think about the value of participation and participatory environments?
Yeah, I see this question a lot, and it gets asked in a lot of our training classes quite a lot as well. For me, I think about what is the goal, and for me, the goal for me is not, as a facilitator, it's not to have everybody contributing or speaking. For me, I want to make sure that the ideas are coming out. So if someone is introverted and they don't feel like they can add value, or they don't feel like they need to contribute, I think we should think about our Scrum value of respecting that person to have that stance. That's fine. But what troubles me is if there is a good idea lurking and that doesn't come out. So for me, like I say, the goal isn't to get everybody speaking, it's to make sure that there's the right environment to allow ideas to surface. So again, as Simon says, it depends very much on context. What's the environment like? Do people feel psychologically safe? I might use techniques where people can just put their thoughts anonymously, maybe a suggestion box or something like that is available during the sprint, that people can just put anonymous ideas in, and then we open it up during the sprint and just go through it as a group. We don't know where that idea came from, but it kind of kicks off that conversation. Or even in the retrospective itself, have people just add ideas on post-it notes and put them on a board, and maybe do some sort of affinity map technique where give a few minutes for everybody to think about, we can use classic retrospective techniques like what went well, what didn't go well, capture your thoughts on post-it notes anonymously. We just put them on a board. We don't care where the thoughts have come from. Then we can arrange and look for where we've got duplicates, or where we can form groups around themes, etc. And then that's starting the conversation as a group together. Why do we as a collective, why have we got that sense emerging?
May I add something?
Please do. And then please answer the other part of my question. It's when you take a retrospective item into the sprint and you don't see any movement on that, what would that signal to the team? And maybe the person who's facilitating some of the events.
Before we continue, I think we should clarify the understanding of the word facilitation. If I'm not mistaken, it's French, and it means something making it easy for the team, I would say.
Facile means easy, yeah.
Yeah, making it easy for the team. So I would see it as making it easy for the team to come to a specific outcome. So oftentimes the outcome is given if you think of Scrum events. So at the sprint planning, we want to have a sprint goal and so on. And now if you combine this idea with a general idea in sports or general in software development, if something is hard, you need to do it more often. Okay, if you have a hard time to release to production, you should do it more often. And the idea of the sprint retrospective is not beneficial or not effective. Maybe you need to do it more often. And one easy way, why not do a retrospective every day? Just a very small one to get people used to it, to share their observations about a day, something like that. So it's like a kind of behavior change. Because oftentimes, what I see, retrospective is such a big thing, 3 hours, the whole team, different room, and this makes a little bit, whoa, what shall I do here now? And if you make it a little bit more like a ritual, like every day, it's quite natural. That's also something you could change. Do it every day at the end of the workday, everybody provides a short feedback about the day. Then you have something. Okay, now the other question, what happens or what should we do as facilitator if the team does not pick up the retrospective improvement item? Yeah.
Sure.
So
What would
first
you
and
look
foremost,
at? Yeah.
so there are a couple of, maybe we need to clarify the context. So the first thing, what is very important to understand, even if you do sprints, the world does not magically slow down. So there can a lot of stuff happen in the next sprint, and maybe there's something more important as the improvement item. Nobody knows. So for assume the production environment is down or something, maybe that is more important. So let's say this is not the case and the team still does not pick it up. I think that's could be a sign that not everybody sees value in it or did contribute towards it. So there's a term, I think it's called strong outcome, which means that everybody contributes to it. And it's more likely that everybody really owns the change afterwards and does everything to change it. So maybe we can dig a little bit deeper into that one.
I think with the number of questions, we're gonna just hold off on that just for a minute. But I do want to get us at least have that come across around the notion of strong outcome and facilitation and weak outcomes. And I'm just gonna quickly, there's some more questions that are interesting around the retro, and then I'd like to move on to the review. One of the questions was around, when you're working remote and we're in this virtual world and we're doing retrospectives, what are some suggestions around tools or ways that we can create that environment? I think we've all used Mural or Miro, those kind of online whiteboarding tools. Mural, at least for me, has a place where when you're voting and doing things, you can go into an anonymous, I guess. You can kind of ghost it and then people can contribute that way. So that's something there. There's something interesting, and David, you and I have talked about this around the notion of icebreakers in retrospective. So one, the question is, do you have any suggestions on icebreakers in general? And two, what should we watch out in terms of icebreakers? And I'm thinking about the recent class that you just had.
Yeah, it's I think it's always thinking about what's the purpose of the events, what we're trying to get out of it, and I'm hoping that again, as people work together in a team, that they're enjoying working with each other. But I think one thing that we kind of just need to be a little bit careful is that we don't try to force the fun too much. The example that you mentioned, it was a professional Scrum for software development class that I ran recently. In that class, we run actual sprints. And we're running 3 sprints over a period of 3 days. So very short sprints, very short time boxes, 10 minutes for the retrospective. And one of the teams still felt that they had to do a fun icebreaker. So they started off by telling each other jokes. And these were people that were, they'd worked with each other, they knew each other, they were comfortable with each other. So they almost felt like it was obligatory to do something fun to kick off the retrospective. And as the trainer, I was like, you've got 10 minutes. You're spending time telling each other jokes. How is this adding to you understanding how your sprint could be improved? So I think those things are important, but we shouldn't lose context of the goal of what we're trying to get out from a particular event. Other extremes I've seen for sprint retrospectives, another team that I remember working with, they were quite new to Scrum, been doing it for a few months, and I asked them what's the purpose of the sprint retrospective, and with a straight face their answer was to moan. And it's again that's missing the point. So you've kind of got those extremes, and it's always thinking about what is the purpose of the events. How can we create a format or facilitate in such a way that we're getting towards the outcome that we want, and we're not just we want to have fun while we're doing it. We want to bond as a group, but it's still thinking with that end goal in mind.
Thank you. That being said, do either of you have some icebreakers that you love? And I guess it would depend on context. Is this a new group, or is this maybe just an icebreaker for, maybe just for a new team coming together, or you're coming into a new group?
one that I've used recently, again, different variations you can do on this. One truth, two lies, I quite like. So if it's to help people get to know
Good
each
old
other,
pub game.
that one, yeah. So each member of the team, give them a few moments to think about what's one thing that's true about myself, two things that are not true, write them down on stickies, and then present them to the rest of the group, and the rest of the group have to guess which one is the truth.
Yeah.
So again, that's a nice icebreaker to just again help people get to know each other a little bit.
Yeah, we've done that too. Simon?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of icebreakers, to be honest. But I learned a very interesting one from Boris, a colleague of ours, and we use it in if we train together. And when we start the Zoom call, we change our name with first name, then where we are located, and then, for instance, what was our first job, or what was our first concert or movie or whatever, and we change it every half day. And people can add to it. So they see, okay, there's something different. I can change my name as well, but they don't have to. So I think one very important element, even if you use Icebreaker or for everything else, you need to provide the people the possibility to not do it. Okay, if you don't feel comfortable with it, don't do it. So you need to establish some kind of working agreements, whatever. Nobody has to do these kind of things. Otherwise, for me, it's too much. Sometimes I'm not feeling making jokes, but everybody else does. And then I'm feeling very uncomfortable, and which puts me in a very bad situation or a bad mood, which will not help for the upcoming event, let's say.
No, we don't want you in a bad mood.
Oh, and I feel I did not answer the last one. What happens if the team does not pick up the item? I want to give at least one action tip. Make it transparent. The improvement item should be part of the sprint backlog. And so this maybe sparks a conversation in the daily Scrum. So everything is moving to done, but this one not. Maybe they see it on their own. It's the easiest thing what you can do. I thought I missed this one.
Thank you for that. So then I thought we would go to the review, but actually maybe let's go to the daily Scrum. So the daily Scrum, there's definitely several techniques. What techniques do you like to use? And maybe give some pros and cons of that, so that we know it shouldn't just be a status update meeting. What is something that you, David, like to use, and what are some pros and cons of those techniques?
Do I only get one?
Let's start with one.
I like the walk the board technique, where we're focused on the sprint backlog and we're looking at how work is actually progressing. And rather than asking question of the workers, we're asking question of the work. So rather than saying to an individual, Patricia, what did you do yesterday? What are you going to do today? Have you got any impediments? We can ask those questions of the work itself. So how is this product backlog item? How is product backlog item X? How did that progress yesterday? How is it going to progress today? And are there any impediments? So we're focused on making progress with the work. I find that leads to a much more sort of synchronized discussion. If we're asking them the traditional 3 questions, we might see what you're doing yesterday, what you're going to do today. Then we might go to Simon, who's talking about another item. Then we might go to a third team member who then talks about something that they paired with you on, for example. And we're kind of jumping all over the context a little bit. So when we focus on the work, for me, I think we get a lot clearer alignment on what's happening to the work. Now, I think the con with that is, well, what if there's somebody who hasn't really spoken because we're talking about what's happened to the work? So some might see that walk the board technique is a way that some people can potentially maybe hide in terms of what they're actually doing. But again, I'm hoping with visualization techniques like avatars on the work items that can kind of alleviate that a little bit. But yeah, that can be a bit of a danger with that technique.
Simon, do you have a different technique for daily Scrum?
Yes, and I would like not to focus so much on techniques. David did a great job on that. So I think the biggest mistake you can make as a Scrum Master is to come in and start changing and adding techniques. So I think if you start with a new team, take your time and observe at least 2 or 3 weeks. And maybe another step, so it's one of the important facilitation techniques, I would say, observing. And the next thing is assume good intent. There's a big likelihood that the people do not know how to make it better because they don't know what the outcome of the daily Scrum should actually be. So maybe start educating about the outcome of all the events and then let them rate on a scale from 1 to 5. How do you think, how good are you achieving those outcomes for each of the events? Don't make it as specific as the daily Scrum. And then if the daily Scrum has a rating, a low rating, then maybe, can I help you? And now you can start changing something, because I see so many people who just adding techniques, and I don't think now it's facilitation because they make it even harder for the team. Okay, you say, okay, you make something wrong, you need to do it like that, and so on. And so, and with this approach, I think you are more helpful. So you do a better facilitation job. And then we can use what we already heard from David. But I think the first step is the important one. That are my 2 cents.
Thank you. Great. And that was really helpful. I found it very helpful. So we have a lot of questions to go through. And if we don't get through all your questions, maybe what that means is that we'll host another one of these sessions and we'll go through the rest of them, or maybe we'll answer them through blogs or something like that. But we definitely are seeing all the questions. So let's move on to the sprint review. David, in a sprint review, this is a question that we get all the time, is what do you do when everybody's really quiet? The second level of that is, what do you do when no one attends? So how do we improve collaboration, and especially how do we think about engaging stakeholders and getting their feedback, and we're looking at that as a team so that we can move forward into planning to work on a new fun goal. What do you think?
In terms of getting people to attend, again, I was involved in a conversation very recently about that particular company who's suffering from that problem. The advice used to be bring cake. That always used to work. If there's food, if there's cake, if there's biscuits, people are kind of drawn to that. That technique has kind of fallen by the wayside as we've been more remote. I think when we talk about the purpose of the sprint review to get feedback from our stakeholders, we use this term stakeholder quite generally. I think a useful technique to do is stakeholder mapping, where it's identifying your different types of stakeholders and how do they need to be kept informed. Because some of them, yes, they've got interest in your product, but maybe, for example, only from a financial point of view. So do they need to come to the sprint review? Maybe not, maybe just sending them a regular report. So it's identifying the different types of stakeholders, maybe looking for different groups and coming up with a plan on how you can interact with which ones. So we're really interested in those stakeholders that are highly interested and could have a big impact on our product. Those are the ones that we need in the sprint review. And it comes back to transparency again. So I think it's useful to maybe we can record the sprint review. Maybe we can produce some meeting minutes. Maybe we can produce a report on how the product backlog has been adapted as a result of the conversations in sprint review. And this is what's happened in the sprint review. If you want to have skin in the game in terms of influencing the product backlog, then you need to be an attendee. That's what we're trying to communicate. If you're not there, if you're just kind of throwing requests over the sort of fence at the team, you're not really going to be treated as potentially a first-class stakeholder as some of the other by the product owner as potentially some of those other stakeholders. So again, there's an education piece here talking about what the purpose of the sprint review is, and again, educating in terms of it is that formal opportunity for the stakeholders to have that touch point with the Scrum team. And if they want to influence the product backlog, this is the best way to do it.
So there's some interesting, thank you for that. There's some interesting resources that listeners might find interesting. I think we did do a webinar on facilitation techniques for the sprint review, and this was a big topic about attendance and some different techniques to use there. And there's certainly there's a vlog by Ravi Verma, actually, David, that's called "Why Won't Anybody Come to My Parties?" So maybe that's a helpful thing, and we'll see where those are. Simon, did you have anything that you want to add?
Yes. So I assume you're a Scrum Master. We need to understand this facilitation has limitations. So facilitation, I would define it as helping groups to get to a shared understanding and come to a shared outcome. That's it. That's not the only thing what you can do as a Scrum Master. Maybe you need to switch your approach, take a different stances. Maybe you need to change parts of the organization to get people to the sprint review. And the thing is, if you make a party or create a product, no one magically comes to you. Why? You need to invite them. And even if you invite them, you need to tell them what's in it for them. And most of the sprint reviews I'm seeing, which I also did myself badly, it's all about us as a team. Nobody cares about you as a team from a stakeholder perspective. What's in it for me from a stakeholder? So gather those information, and if you present those information in the sprint review, it's more likely that people are coming.
Thank you. I think it's to think about the persona and the schedule of the people who you need that feedback from. They're usually not, but some of them are just like, I'm a very busy person, right? And so when they get there, they want to understand the impact and the outcomes of what's going on and what value is going into that. All right. So let's talk about during the sprint. And Simon, if I could stay with you, there's a question, and this leads us nicely into some other topics around conflict. But this question says, in my team, we have a very few people who are very vocal and they're high performing. And then we have some people who don't share or contribute at all. I don't know if that means that they're high performing or not. What would you suggest from a facilitation perspective? What could that person do to foster more participation and kind of keep the balance of the team? And the reason I'm asking you, because you and I think a lot about scaling. When you add people onto a team, what happens to that? And just the balance of the notion of participation. And I think this might be a great place to talk about strong outcomes and weak outcomes.
Yeah. So what we typically have is people which are very vocal are very fast in providing their ideas. And of course, their idea is brilliant, but maybe we miss out on some other ideas. And there is the downside that if some person starts talking out loud, which there's a phenomenon which is called groupthink. For everybody else, they typically jump onto the same thought. It's very hard to have a distinct thought if somebody says already something. And in order to maximize different ideas, thoughts, diversity, we should somehow pay attention that everybody has a time to think and everybody can contribute their ideas at the beginning. There are a couple of techniques what you can do. You could ask everyone, please write down your ideas on how to solve whatever problem on a sticky note. Put it on the wall, and this happens everything in silent. At least we gather now all the ideas. And then the next step, we can start to discussing. And now you have people which are very vocal and talk a lot. Maybe you need to introduce a couple of different techniques to give everybody the same amount of time to speak. So you can do it with round-based timing. So you're the first person, provide your opinion. You're the second person, you get 1 minute to provide your opinion, and so on. That's some things you can try. That would my take.
Mm. David, if I can ask you to elaborate on this.
Yeah, there's a couple of techniques that jumped into my head. So if we've got that very vocal person that's putting forward ideas, maybe we could use a technique like troika consulting, where that person's idea is put on the table. But with troika, okay, everybody acts as the consultants, and that person whose idea is being discussed or whose problem is being discussed, because again, it's how you ask the question, but that person basically turns around, turns their back to the team, and the rest of the team debate what the problem is or the potential solution that has been put forward by this person. Troika, it's called. I just saw in the chat window, Troika. So again, that person is practicing active listening while the rest of the group is discussing the idea that's been put forward. Another one that came into my mind was Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hats. And again, this is a technique where you metaphorically, you don't literally have to wear hats, but you metaphorically wear different hats, and the different colors represents different ways of looking at the problem. Like, we're going to take the stance of being an optimist. Let's just focus on the positives of this idea, what's being put forward. Or we're going to go with a more judgmental hat. We're going to try to critique it. So there's different ways, and again, you're getting people to think in particular analytical ways. So again, if I'm someone that's very vocal or pushing my ideas, again, I have to take part as a peer in terms of, like, I'm going to criticize that same idea that came from me, for example. So again, for me, I'm less worried about people contributing and just making sure that the idea or the question is being properly sort of analyzed and creating shared understanding across the group.
So this brings us nicely to a couple other questions around conflict, and I think you've given some great techniques around there. There was a question in here that's interesting about, what do you do when you have a colleague or a team member who's always just kind of looks like they're blaming you, and I like to call that they're always looking for faulty feedback. And that brings us really to conflict within a team. And I want to preface this because it's something that I'm writing an article about right now. But the notion that when we are a group of creative people coming together, diverse, and we're trying to work in a complex area, there's going to be conflict. There should be conflict because we have different ideas. And so what we're trying to do is kind of get to a new and better idea together. But that can sometimes, depending on the safety and the environment, lead to conflict, lead to blaming, lead to all these things. Simon, do you have any stories just from your personal scars, or maybe your work experience? Well, I was going to be very specific, and then I remember we were being recorded, about conflict, and just what have you done that's worked or not worked well from a facilitation standpoint, maybe in a team, and people arguing almost.
So I think the first thing what we need to be very honest to ourselves, are we able to navigate or resolve conflicts? So I don't think that's a typical skill of a Scrum Master. I think if everything is about the topic in hand, you can use facilitation. It's about finding the best ideas, combining ideas, come to a shared outcome. Totally fine. But if you go to a conflict, to a real conflict, where it's not about the topic, it's more about you are right and you are wrong, and it's more about the people, and the behavior is not accepted, then we should be very careful if you really want to do it and if you are capable, because it's easy to make it even worse. And now, what I used in the past, there is a test to see where we are. So one thing you can hear is it really about the topic? Is the topic a good idea or a bad idea, or is this about the person? Again, you provided such a bad idea. That's something you need to look for. And then you could ask a question. Please say me something good about that person, what you like about him. And if the other person cannot provide anything what he likes about that other person, then you have a serious conflict. And then it's not about the topic in hand, and it's about the people. And then you need to decide, am I capable of navigating or facilitating these kind of conflicts? And if not, put the people in different rooms and get somebody who can help you. And I think that's the term of professional. As a professional Scrum Master, you need to be aware what you can do and what you cannot do, and where we are in terms of the conflict from the levels. So that's the first thing. And if you don't have such a high conflict where it's about people and not about the topic in hand, one thing what you always should try to do is every person should have the time to provide the ideas, and everyone should listen to the other ideas. And that's the crucial point. Okay, make sure that everybody listens what the others are saying. And that's one thing to resolve a very lightweight conflict.
Thank you. And there's a lot of deep stuff. That's where there's a model called the groan zone that we talk about, that's based off of Sam Kaner's work, Kaner, where sometimes it's bottled up conflict. So there's those types of things. And when you're trying to make decisions, it's hard. David, would you like to add anything, or would you like to take the next questions on refinement?
I think I would just add as well that I've seen conflicts where it's actually between different members of the team, but also the team and the Scrum Master as well. And I think it's important to remember when we're talking about facilitation, it's not just the Scrum Master's job. Ultimately, the Scrum Master is the team's coach. So can the Scrum Master teach the team or coach the team to facilitate for themselves? And I think if we can get into that sort of place, then we're in a really sort of healthy position. So can we get the developers facilitating their own daily scrums, for example? So it's not always about the Scrum Master. I think it's important to add.
Oh, so you wanted these questions instead. So I'll let the audience know where I'm going to go with this. We're going to talk about facilitation and who facilitates on the team and the notion of neutrality. I think we should talk about refinement, and then we'll come back to facilitation in general. There's still so many questions. So then, David, can you talk about how if there's different people that can facilitate on a Scrum team? We want that. Can you then talk about neutrality and how do you participate? So for instance, if I am the Scrum Master and I am facilitating the retrospective, what do I do? Because now we have another issue of conflict and safety. You talked about the team against the Scrum Master.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it's just recognizing that you do have this other hat to wear. You are, again, if as a Scrum team we're agreeing this retrospective, the Scrum Master is the facilitator. But remember, the Scrum Master is part of the Scrum team, so they're taking part as a peer. So yes, they should be taking part from the sense of, you know, they were involved in the sprints, hopefully. So again, I think it's again using the right sort of techniques. For example, if we look at, I'm not going to talk about retrospective, but if I look at something like if we're sizing using planning poker, for example, the Scrum Master can facilitate that, but if they're the Scrum Master, but they're also a developer, they can take part in the planning poker. So again, they might be running the events, but they're asking questions as a developer. They're doing their sizing as a developer as well. So the point is that they're running the meeting without sort of jumping in and saying, right, let's do planning poker. I think it's a 13, but let's see what everybody else thinks. No, it's still trying to remain neutral and running the event in such a way that they're keeping things flowing, but they're not sort of biasing or influencing the rest of the group because they're seen as the facilitator. Tricky to do, but I think it's just being aware of it, I think, is a first step. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the retrospective, again, if we're using a technique like 1, 2, 4 all, like Simon mentioned, or if we're using just capturing ideas on sticky notes and doing some sort of affinity mapping, again, the Scrum Master sort of just explaining this is a technique that we're going to do. I'm going to take part as a team member as well.
Yeah, and making sure that that's clear and that people agree to that, I think, is important. All right, Simon, so you've had enough time to think about refinement now. I have a specific question here, and then please share more of your experience and techniques. So we've gone through some of the different events, product backlog, refinement. when we're going through the product backlog is not an event, but it's pretty important leading up to planning. So this question is, we work with a lot of various external suppliers. We invite them into our refinements to discuss new projects. Good for you. How do I make sure that we keep a certain structure in these kind of sessions where we're facilitating these external suppliers in refinement? And I think in general, how do we facilitate the structure of refinement?
Yeah, I think what we should start with every facilitation is what is actually the purpose? What is the goal? I don't know what the goal is in that specific refinement session. I think the general goal of refinement is to understand the product better, product backlog better. And here it could be more specific. So what is the actual outcome? I think the first thing what you can help the team to make it easier is to get what is the specific outcome we are looking for. That's the first thing. Now, if you have clarified this, now what could be possible steps to get there? So it could start, what is the time frame? So have you 1 hour, 2 hours, and so on? What things needs to be discussed? And so I would do it a little bit more dynamic and ask, so what are the topics you would like to discuss in order to get to that outcome? And maybe the next thing is, okay, how much time should we need for each of those topics? That would be a very lightweight approach. And then maybe we need to add on a little bit more and try to involve everyone and so on. But I think the first thing is you need to create some kind of frame for the refinement. So where do we go? What's the time box? Who should be here? Who should not be here? And so on. How do we make decisions? These would be my first idea to get started.
I think an important concept that I'd share is that in terms of thinking about facilitation, it's not just what happens in that time box. When you're facilitating, it's what you do before and what you do after to make sure that we're meeting the outcome. And then having that agenda and structuring it definitely is important. So a little bit off of that, David, this one's an interesting question. Is there a particular facilitation technique that can be used to discuss the viability of new products among different teams, product engineering, to have more ideas, more discussions? And I'm thinking of that because of the work you do in design thinking and all your books.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Viability is quite a big word, and it could mean viability in terms of, is it technically viable? Is it viable in terms of, is there a market for the product? So it's part of the nature of the type of work that we do. We're dealing with a lot of unknowns. So really it's about what can we do to test the idea as cheaply and as quickly as possible, really. In Scrum, we talk about getting to a done increment every sprint so that we can put something into the customer's hands to release that value, but also get feedback on it. And I think a lot of thinking in the agile space is sort of based on this, but we can think about, actually, is that the cheapest, fastest thing we can do to check the viability of these things? It could actually be the most expensive thing we do is to actually build the product. Could we do something in a more lightweight way, such as build a prototype and get some feedback on that from some key users? Could we carry out maybe just some surveys and ask users about potential ideas that we've got? So rather than build the product and put it out there and hope for the best, we're looking for more lightweight ways of testing ideas. So yeah, I think that's kind of going to that next level of how do we get even faster feedback on something to, again, have more confidence on the journey that we're taking.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so we have less than, well, we have 6 minutes to be very specific what we have left. There's some great questions, and I think it would be remiss if we didn't talk about remote and a hybrid kind of stuff, and some different ideas there. There's a specific question that says, my remote team is very large, with almost 20 people, and sometimes they're trying to split the team, but in general, so this is a large Scrum team. Simon, how do you, when they're remote, how do you keep that engagement, especially during the Scrum events? And what do you do? This is tough. I'm very sorry. they're reluctant to turn on their cameras. So what techniques can you use to get everyone engaged? And so I'm thinking even in a hybrid environment, that's hard too. You might have some people who are online, some people who are not. And that creates an unbalance. What are some, I guess, ideas and observations that you have around this remote and hybrid way of working from a facilitation standpoint?
Okay, we have two. I have two thoughts here. So first and foremost, it's a technology question. So if you don't have the right technology, that's a difficult one. So no matter how large the group is, in order to have full participation, you need to split up in smaller groups. That's a given. And this depends in a virtual setting a lot on the technology, if you can do it or not. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, what happened if people do not start their camera? And I think as a Scrum Master, you need to be a role model in terms of the Scrum values, and maybe you need to be very open and point that out. Hey, I'm seeing a bunch of you do not start your cameras. I think it has this and this outcome or this and this downside. What does the rest of you think? And this opens now the opportunity for you to facilitate the discussion. Because if people now are replying to your answer, you can ask, okay, can everybody share their opinion and so on to get progress here? Because sometimes we think it's a problem, but it's actually not a problem for the team. It's just a problem for you. And that's a very dangerous thing. We need to pay attention. So you need to somehow get better technology if this is an issue. You need to figure out if it's really a problem for the group. And if it's so, help the group to overcome it. In my understanding, you cannot force people, but you can always encourage people and show them the benefits if they would contribute with camera on and so on.
Mm.
Yeah. But to be honest, there's no silver bullet magic pill, which immediately works. At least I don't know it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe David knows the silver bullet.
David, I'm going to give you a closing question. So we've established this notion of facilitation. We've talked a little bit about neutrality. We've talked about that anybody can facilitate if the team agrees to it. Someone outside, that might work too. It's not a special role in Scrum. So inspection and adaptation, how do you know if you're doing a good job facilitating? How do you know what skills you need to improve as a facilitator, what your weak spots are? And I will share first on the Scrum.org website, there is a page that we'll share that has a list of traits and facilitator skills. And that you can already start kind of looking at and saying, hey, I'm good at this, I'm not good at this, I wasn't aware of this. But what have you used yourself?
It's a good question. Yeah, I've looked back at myself years ago and how I would facilitate events or other sessions and think, oh my God, what was I thinking? And I'll probably look at myself in another 5 years' time and kind of think think the same, right? So again, I don't think it's like you say, it's not just about the session itself. It's not coming out of the session saying, hey, we hit the time box. Hey, we've got through all of our agenda items.
Hey, everybody was talking. Hey, everybody smiled and had fun.
You know. Exactly. Yeah, all the jokes that everybody was telling, they were funny. It goes back to I go back to those facilitation principles. We've got the Scrum values. We talk about this in the PSFS class about the facilitation principles, and I think they're great sort of guidance, good things to fall back on. One thing that I think about is, did we make clear what the purpose was? Was there a clear purpose for the event, and was that purpose fulfilled? And maybe I can monitor what happens after that session or event. So, for example, we talked about sprint retrospectives. We know that the purpose of the sprint retrospective is for Scrum Team to inspect and adapt itself, come up with some improvement actions, right? Yes, if we're coming out with sprint retrospective with that, that's great. But is that being followed up on? Has that purpose been fulfilled in terms of not just coming up with that action, but being followed up on? So purposefulness is one of those facilitation principles that I might test myself against, and I might be looking at the others. Just very quickly, was it a healthy? Did people feel psychologically safe? How are we with transparency? What about participation? A lot of the stuff that we've been talking about today. So falling back to those first principles is a way that I'd measure myself.
All right. Well, thank you very much, both of you. There was a lot of information. Thank you for everyone who's listening. Again, there's a lot of different resources that are out there. They're in the chat. We will have them in the notes. A lot of your questions, we'll see them. And we have a lot of resources there. We, again, did do a webinar that's live, David Spinks and myself. Simon is doing one on facilitation in German, if that's a language that you speak and understand. So you can get more questions into him there. But thank you very much for attending, and we'll see you again soon.